What if I told you Henry VIII had a secret daughter who lived in the shadows of the Tower of London, close enough to the throne to destroy everything, but too dangerous to ever acknowledge? For centuries, historians buried her name. Royal records hid the truth, but land grants don't lie. Neither do the whispers that echoed through Tudor court. This is Audrey Malt, the daughter the king could never claim, the girl raised by a tailor, but showered with estates fit for royalty, the woman who attended Princess Elizabeth in her darkest hour, sharing tears behind prison walls like sisters, because perhaps they were. Henry acknowledged his bastard son and made him a Jew, but his daughters, he erased them, buried them in comfortable silence, because in the Tudor world, illegitimate daughters weren't just worthless, they were weapons, and Ethelreda was the most dangerous of all. Before we expose the truth they tried to erase for 500 years, do me one favor. If you believe history's darkest secrets deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. It keeps this channel alive, and honestly, it means everything. Now, let's uncover what the crown never wanted you to know. They called her Audrey, sometimes Ethelreda, a name stolen from saints, given to a child born in shadow. The records say she came into this world sometime between 1527 and 1535, but no one wrote down the exact date. Because bastards don't get birth announcements, they get silence, and Audrey's silence was bought with land. Vast stretches of it. The official story, simple enough. She was the illegitimate daughter of John Malt, the king's personal tailor, a man who stitched royal robes and measured the king's expanding waistline. In September 1546, Malt signed his will. In faded ink, he wrote the words that would define her forever. Audrey Malt, my bastard daughter, begotten on the body of Joan Dingley, now wife of one Dobson. Straightforward, clinical, a tailor acknowledging his mistake. But then the gift started, and they didn't make sense. In May 1541, John Malt received lordships and manors in Berkshire, properties with vicarages and churches attached. In July 1544, he and Ethelreda were granted manors and lands in Somerset worth over £1,800, lands that once belonged to Glastonbury Abbey, seized during the dissolution of the monasteries. By September 1546, another grant arrived, over £1,300 for the lordship and manor of Kevelston. Then came St. Catherine's Court, a sprawling estate that would make nobles envious. This wasn't a bonus for good tailoring. This was a transaction. The price? Malt would claim the girl as his own, raise her, protect her, and never speak the truth, because the truth was breathing inside the palace walls, growing in the belly of a woman who shouldn't have been anywhere near the king's bed. Imagine being that child, growing up in luxury you can't explain. Your father is a tailor, yet you live in a manor that once belonged to monks. You wear fine clothes. You're educated like a lady of the court. People bow when you pass, then whisper when you're gone. Courtiers look at you strangely. Some turn away, as if acknowledging you might be dangerous. As if your very existence is a confession the king can never make. You hear the whispers. You always hear the whispers. They say your real father wears a crown, that his blood runs through your veins, but he will never claim you. Never speak your name in public, because you are a girl. And girls, even royal ones, are only valuable if they're legitimate. If they can be married off to foreign princes. If they can secure alliances. You can do none of those things. You're a weapon that can't be wielded. A secret that can't be told. And so John Malt played his part. He called you daughter. He gave you his name. But the estates didn't come from his purse. They came from a king who needed a cover story. A way to keep one more inconvenient truth from unraveling his already crumbling dynasty. By the time Malt died in 1547, you inherited everything. The land, the titles, the secret, and the knowledge that your entire existence was built on a lie the king paid handsomely to maintain. Her mother's name was Joan Dingley, or Joanna. The records couldn't even agree on that much. What they did agree on was her profession. She was a laundress, one of the faceless women who scrubbed the king's shirts, washed his bed linens, and cleaned the bloody bandages that wrapped his rotting leg ulcers. The women no one remembered, the women no one noticed, until one of them got pregnant. Laundresses weren't just servants, they were keepers of secrets. They knew things about the king's body that even his physicians tried to hide. The stains on his sheets, the pus soaking through his bandages, the intimate evidence of what happened behind closed doors in the royal bedchamber. Discretion wasn't just expected, it was survival. One word in the wrong ear, and you'd disappear. But Joan had access, the kind of access that made dangerous things possible. In the 1520s, the king's privy chambers were guarded like forts. Gentlemen of the bedchamber controlled who entered, But laundresses, they moved through those spaces like ghosts. They collected soiled linens. They delivered fresh shirts. They knew when the king was alone, when his guards were distracted, when opportunity presented itself. And Joan Dingley knew exactly when to be invisible and when to be seen. The timing fits like a blade in a wound. Ethelreda was likely born between 1527 and 1535, right in the middle of what historians call Henry's Great Wait. 7 years of celibacy while he tried to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. 7 years of publicly claiming he wouldn't touch another woman until Anne Boleyn became his wife. 7 years of propaganda about the king's purity and restraint. But men like Henry don't do restraint. Not really. Not when they've spent their entire lives taking whatever they want. So Joan became convenient. A woman close enough to satisfy an appetite, but low enough in status that no one would care. No foreign alliances to complicate. No noble families to offend. Just a laundress who knew how to keep her mouth shut. Until her belly started to swell. Until the secret couldn't be hidden anymore. That's when John Malt entered the story. The tailor. A man who worked in the king's great wardrobe, cutting patterns for royal garments. A man who understood transactions, who knew the value of silence. The deal was struck quickly. Malt would marry Joan or claim the child as his bastard. The paperwork would show him as the father. And in return, the king would make him rich. Joan Dingley disappeared from the records after that. She married a man named Dobson, started a new life far from court. She never raised her daughter, never acknowledged her publicly. The girl was handed to Malt like a package. A problem solved. A scandal avoided. But the baby didn't disappear. She grew up watching, learning, understanding that her existence was a transaction her mother made and walked away from. That her real father was close enough to touch but would never reach for her. And that the price of her silence was measured in manors, estates, and land grants that made no sense for a tailor's bastard daughter. Years later, the truth slipped out. Not from Henry. He took his secrets to the grave, but from the son of the man Ethelreda married, a poet and writer named Sir John Harrington, who wrote a collection of scandalous historical anecdotes called Nugi Antiqui, ancient trifles, little scraps of gossip and truth that powerful people wished would stay buried. In it, he described his father's first wife, Ethelreda, and he didn't call her the daughter of a tailor. He called her the king's natural daughter. According to Harrington, in the 38th year of his reign, 1546, King Henry VIII granted massive estates to John Malt and Ethelreda, not because Malt was a talented tailor, not as a bonus for loyalty, but because the king had special love and regard for the girl. The words matter. Special love. That's not language used for a servant's bastard child. That's the language of blood, of family, of a father trying to provide for a daughter he couldn't publicly claim. Harrington wrote that the estates were granted for her use and benefit, that she was put under Malt's care to hide the truth, that she always passed for Malt's natural daughter, even though everyone at court whispered otherwise. And shortly after those estates were granted, Ethelreda married Harrington's father, a confidential servant of the king, a man Henry trusted, a man who understood discretion. The king arranged the marriage himself. Think about what that means. Henry didn't just give her money and forget about her. He orchestrated her future, chose her husband, made sure she was placed with someone loyal, someone who would protect her, someone who moved in the same circles as nobility but wouldn't threaten the line of succession. This wasn't charity. This was a father securing his daughter's future the only way he could without admitting she existed. Then there's the letter, written decades later in 1656 by a man named Jonathan Leslie. He claimed his information came from Sir Andrew Markham, a descendant of John Harrington's second wife. In it, Leslie wrote that the great King Henry VIII matched his darling daughter to John Harrington. Darling daughter. Not ward. Not the child of a servant he favoured. Daughter. But Henry never signed a document calling her that. Never stood in a church and acknowledged her. Never gave her a title or a place at court beyond what her supposed father as wealth could buy. Because acknowledging illegitimate daughters was pointless. Sons could inherit. Sons could be legitimized if necessary. Sons could carry on a dynasty. But daughters, they were just mouths to feed. Political pawns at best. Scandals at worst. And Ethelreda was a specific kind of scandal. If Henry admitted she was his, he'd have to explain when she was conceived. During his 7-year courtship of Anne Boleyn, the years he swore he was chaste, the years he told the Pope, the Church, and all of Europe that he could end live as a married man because his conscience wouldn't allow it. Admitting he fathered a child with the laundress during that time would expose the lie. prove he wasn't some righteous man torn between duty and morality. Just a king who wanted what he wanted and made up reasons to justify taking it. So if a reader lived in the shadows, wealthy, comfortable, married well, but erased, she became John Harrington's wife in 1548. Not a union she chose herself. The king arranged it before his death, matched his darling daughter, as one letter called her, to a man he trusted. A confidential servant. Someone who served Lord High Admiral Thomas Seymour and moved easily in royal circles. Someone who understood what it meant to keep secrets and protect the interests of people who could protect themselves. Ethelreda lived at court, not as a curiosity, not as a ward, but as someone who belonged there. She attended Princess Elizabeth, moved through the halls of power like she was born to them, because perhaps she was. But she was never introduced as Henry's daughter, never given a royal title, never addressed as anything more than the wealthy wife of a court official. Her legitimacy came from land grants and whispered rumours, not proclamations or ceremonies. Imagine waking up every day knowing you carry royal blood, but can never say it out loud. You watch your supposed half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, tear the kingdom apart fighting over their father's throne. You see their portraits hung in galleries, their names written into law, their legitimacy debated in Parliament. And you're nobody. A footnote. A rumour historians will argue about centuries later. The psychological weight of that existence is crushing. You're close enough to the throne to feel its heat, but forbidden from ever touching it. You attend Elizabeth during her imprisonment in the Tower in 1554, and you weep together. Your husband later writes about the emotional bond between you, how the tears flowed, how you comforted each other like family. Because maybe you were family. Maybe Elizabeth knew. Maybe she looked at you and saw her father's eye staring back. The same sharp nose, the same stubborn jaw, but neither of you could ever say it. And there was always the danger. If the wrong people discovered the truth, you'd become a weapon. Catholic rebels could rally around you as an alternative to Protestant Elizabeth. Foreign powers could marry you off to create rival claims to the throne. Ambitious nobles could use you to destabilize the succession. Your very existence was a threat you didn't choose to be, so you stayed quiet. You accepted the gifts, the estates, the comfortable life Henry bought for you with land and arranged marriages. But you never got the one thing that mattered. Acknowledgement, the simple truth spoken aloud. You are my daughter. I claim you. I see you. Henry gave that to his son, Henry Fitzroy. Made him Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Gave him a household, titles, wealth, and public recognition. Because sons mattered. Sons could carry on dynasties. Sons could be legitimized if necessary. But daughters were complications, and illegitimate daughters were ghosts. Visible, but not acknowledged. Present, but not recorded. Living proof of appetites the king could never admit he had. Ethelreda brought wealth to her marriage. Properties that once belonged to Shaftesbury Abbey. Lordships purchased with money that came from somewhere. She bore a daughter, Hester, around 1550. Raised her quietly. Watched Elizabeth become queen in 1559. Stood at the coronation as one of the honoured attendees. And then she died. That same month. That same year. As if seeing her half-sister crowned was the only closure she'd ever get. March 18th, 1554. 6 women walked through the gates of the Tower of London alongside Princess Elizabeth. Not servants, not guards, ladies, chosen companions who would share her imprisonment. Among them was Audrey Malt Harrington, the wife of a court official, a woman wealthy enough to own estates, but low enough in rank that no one questioned her presence. No one asked why she, of all people, was permitted to attend a princess accused of treason. Elizabeth was terrified. She entered through the same gate her mother, and Boleyn, had walked through 18 years earlier, held in the same apartments where Anne spent her final days before the execution as Blade ended her life. The psychological torture was deliberate. Queen Mary wanted her half-sister to understand how close she was to death, how easily a royal daughter could be erased. And Ethelreda was there, watching, waiting, weeping. Why would a tailor's supposed daughter have access to a princess imprisoned for treason? Why would she be trusted to stay close during such a dangerous, politically volatile moment? Ladies attending Elizabeth needed to be vetted. Loyal, beyond suspicion. Yet Ethelreda was chosen, as if she had some unspoken connection to Elizabeth that went deeper than court politics. As if someone believed she could be trusted in ways others couldn't. Elizabeth's confinement lasted 2 months. 2 months of interrogations, of waiting for the eggs to fall, of watching others executed for the same crime she was accused of. Lady Jane Grey had been beheaded just weeks earlier. Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's childhood friend, sat in a cell nearby under sentence of death. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the leader of the rebellion that implicated Elizabeth, was tortured and executed, his head displayed on a spike. A warning, a promise. Through it all, Ethelreda stayed. The historical record says she and the other ladies wept with Elizabeth, shared her fear, comforted her in ways words couldn't capture. There's something deeply emotional about that image. A princess facing execution, surrounded by women who loved her, and one of those women might have been her half-sister. Someone who understood what it meant to live in the shadow of Henry VIII, to carry his blood but never speak it aloud. Did Elizabeth know? Did someone whisper the truth to her during those long, dark nights in the Tower? Did Ethelreda confess the secret she'd carried her entire life? Or was it something unspoken? A recognition between two women who shared a father, but not a fate. Elizabeth's mother was executed, Ethelreda's mother was paid off and disappeared. Elizabeth fought for her legitimacy her entire childhood. Ethelreda never had a chance at legitimacy. Both were daughters of a king who chose power over family, who saw them as problems to manage rather than people to protect. When Elizabeth was finally released on May 19th, the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution, Ethelreda was still by her side. The bond they formed in that prison stayed with them. Years later, when Elizabeth became queen, Ethelreda attended her coronation, stood in Westminster Abbey and watched her half-sister crowned, the girl no one acknowledged, witnessing the triumph of the girl everyone tried to destroy. And then, just weeks later, Ethelreda died, as if her purpose had been fulfilled, as if seeing Elizabeth safe on the throne was the only ending her story needed. Ethelreda wasn't alone in the shadows. She was part of a quiet network of children Henry fathered and then buried in silence. Names that surface in historical records with just enough evidence to raise questions but never enough to demand answers. Catherine Carey, Elizabeth Tailboys. Maybe others lost entirely to time. Girls who carried royal blood but were born into a world that had no use for illegitimate daughters. Catherine Carey was born around 1524 to Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister. Mary had been Henry's mistress before he ever became obsessed with Anne. Some historians believe the affair lasted years. Others claim it ended by 1524, right around the time Catherine was born. The timing is suspicious. Mary was married to William Carey, a courtier with connections but no real power, when Catherine was born. No one questioned Carey's paternity publicly, but whispers followed her entire life. Catherine grew up at court. She served Anne of Cleves as a maid of honor at her wedding to Henry in 1539. She was young then, maybe 14 or 15, but already moving in royal circles. After Elizabeth became queen, Catherine remained close to her, served in her household, attended her regularly. The bond between them felt deeper than duty, felt like family, because maybe it was. Her brother, Henry Carey, born around 1526, also enjoyed unusual favour. He became Baron Hunsdon under Elizabeth's reign. Wealthy, powerful, trusted, but Henry VIII never acknowledged either of them, never gave them titles, never provided dowries or estates beyond what their supposed father, William Carey, could leave them. And when Carey died young in 1528, Henry did grant Mary Boleyn some financial relief, but he framed it as charity, kindness to a former mistress, not responsibility to his children. Then there's Elizabeth Tailboys, born between April and June 1520 to Bessie Blount, the same mistress who gave Henry his only acknowledged bastard son, Henry Fitzroy. Bessie was married of quickly to Gilbert Tailboys after Fitzroy's birth, but the records show Elizabeth was conceived just months after Fitzroy, before Bessie's marriage, at a time when the king was still visiting her, still in her bed. Elizabeth Norton, a historian who spent years researching the Tailboys family, found something chilling. The king took an unusual interest in Elizabeth Tailboys. In 1541, during his royal progress north with Catherine Howard, Henry stayed overnight at Elizabeth's home. He arranged her marriage to Thomas Wimbish, a royal ward with significant wealth. When Wimbish petitioned to call himself Lord Tailboys in right of his wife's inheritance, Henry denied the request. He protected Elizabeth's title, her estates, her financial independence. Why would a king care that much about the daughter of a former mistress, unless she was more than that? The Tailboys family certainly suspected. Elizabeth was treated with hostility by her paternal grandmother. Court cases erupted between her and the Tailboys' relatives, all trying to limit her access to the family estates, as if they knew she wasn't truly one of them, as if her blood came from somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't challenge openly but resented deeply. These women lived parallel lives, wealthy but not noble, connected but not claimed. They attended the same courts, served the same queens, maybe even recognized each other as something more than just courtiers. Maybe they understood, in ways no one else could, what it meant to be erased. Henry Fitzroy was different. He was the only one Henry ever truly claimed, born June 1519 to Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie, the king's mistress during the years Catherine of Aragon failed pregnancy after pregnancy. When Fitzroy was born healthy, screaming, male, Henry couldn't contain his pride. This was proof the problem wasn't him. Proof his body could produce sons. Proof that God hadn't cursed his bloodline. The only curse was Catherine's womb. Fitzroy wasn't just acknowledged, he was celebrated. At 6 years old, he was made Earl of Nottingham in a lavish ceremony at Bridewell Palace. Then, moments later, elevated again to Duke of Richmond and Somerset, a double dukedom. There were only 2 other dukes in all of England at that time, and suddenly this 6-year-old boy outranked almost every noble in the kingdom. Richmond was a title tied to the Tudors. Henry VII had been Earl of Richmond before seizing the throne. Somerset traced back to the Beauforts, descended from John of Gaunt's illegitimate son. Henry wasn't just acknowledging Fitzroy, he was linking him to royal bloodlines, preparing him, positioning him. Fitzroy was given estates, titles, a household, education fit for a prince. He was elected to the Order of the Garter, made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, summoned to Parliament. At 17, he had more power and recognition than most legitimate nobles achieved in a lifetime, because he was a son. And sons, even bastard sons, had value. They could inherit, could be legitimized, could carry on dynasties. His sisters never received any of that. Not Ethelreda, not Catherine Carey, not Elizabeth Tailboys. They were ghosts. But Fitzroy was paraded through court like a prince in waiting, and for years it seemed possible he might become one. Catherine of Aragon only gave Henry one surviving child, Mary, a daughter. By 1525, it was clear Catherine would have no more children. If Henry couldn't remarry and produce a legitimate son, Fitzroy was the backup, the insurance policy, the proof that Tudor blood could produce male heirs. But then everything collapsed. July 23rd, 1536. Fitzroy died at St. James's Palace, 17 years old, probably tuberculosis. Consumption, they called it. The same disease that would kill his half-brother Edward VI 17 years later. Fitzroy had attended in Boleyn's execution just 2 months earlier. Watched his father's second wife beheaded for treason and adultery. Watched Henry declare Elizabeth, his half-sister, a bastard just like him. And then he got sick. Rapidly, violently. Within weeks he was dead. The king was devastated. This was the son he'd pinned his hopes on, the boy he'd groomed for greatness, the living proof that he could father sons. And now he was gone, buried quietly, almost secretly, wrapped in lead and transported in a closed cart to Framlingham Church in Suffolk. No state funeral, no grand ceremony, just a body smuggled away in the night like something shameful. Henry outlived Fitzroy by a decade. Jane Seymour gave him Edward the next year, and suddenly Fitzroy's death didn't matter as much politically. But emotionally, it shattered something in the king. Because Fitzroy had been the only illegitimate child Henry treated like he mattered, and even he couldn't escape death, couldn't fulfill the destiny Henry had mapped out for him, couldn't save the king from the terror of dying without a strong male heir. If Henry had claimed Ethelreda publicly, everything would have changed. Not for the better. Acknowledging illegitimate daughters wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Because the Tudor dynasty was built on sand. Henry VII seized the throne through conquest, not inheritance. His claim was weak, contested, constantly under threat from surviving Plantagenets who had better bloodlines and stronger arguments. The last thing Henry VIII needed was more complications in an already chaotic succession. By 1536, both of his legitimate daughters had been declared bastards. Mary, stripped of her title after Henry annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth, reduced from princess to illegitimate child after Anne Boleyn's execution. A second act of succession that year stated the crown would pass to Henry's sons, first by Jane Seymour, then by any future wife. If no sons survived, daughters born of Jane or later queens could inherit. But Mary and Elizabeth, written out, erased, both illegitimate at the same time. Now imagine adding Ethelreda to that mess. Or Catherine Carey, or Elizabeth Tailboys. Publicly acknowledged illegitimate daughters would muddy the waters even further. They couldn't inherit the throne. Illegitimacy and female gender meant they had zero legal claim. But that didn't mean enemies couldn't use them, marry them off to foreign princes, rally support around them as figureheads. claimed they were more legitimate than Henry's other daughters because at least they were born of annulled marriages. The political chaos would be endless. Worse, acknowledging them would give them status. Power. Their families would gain influence at court. Mary Boleyn's relatives. The Blount family. Joan Dingley's connections. Suddenly, people Henry couldn't fully control would have leverage, could make demands, could threaten the delicate balance of power he'd spent decades building. And for what? Daughters couldn't secure the dynasty, couldn't carry the Tudor name forward, couldn't inherit the throne unless every legitimate option died first. Even Henry's own legitimate daughters barely mattered to him. Mary spent years in disgrace, forced to serve her infant half-sister Elizabeth as a servant, denied her title, threatened with treason charges if she refused to accept her mother's marriage, was invalid. Elizabeth fared little better, declared illegitimate as a toddler, raised in uncertainty, imprisoned in the Tower under her half-sister Mary's reign. Both lived under constant threat of execution. Both were pawns in a game that valued male heirs above everything. So what chance did Ethelreda have? Or Catherine? Or Elizabeth Tailboys? None. They were useful as long as they stayed silent, as long as they accepted the gifts, the estates, the arranged marriages, the comfortable obscurity. The moment they became public, they became threats, tools enemies could use against the king, embarrassments that revealed his hypocrisy, proof that his claims of piety and restraint were lies. The safest strategy was the one Henry chose. Pay them off, give them land, arrange good marriages, keep them close enough to monitor, far enough to deny, and never, ever write their names into official records as his children. Let future historians argue about it. Let the evidence remain just ambiguous enough to cast doubt. Let them live and die as footnotes, wealthy, forgotten, erased, because acknowledging them openly would risk everything. And Henry VIII never risked anything for daughters, not even his own. There was another daughter, one historians only discovered in recent years, Elizabeth Tailboys, born somewhere between April and June 1520 to the same woman who gave Henry his precious son Fitzroy, Elizabeth Blount. Bessie, the king's favourite mistress before Boleyn consumed his attention, before the obsession with sons became an all-consuming madness. The timing is devastating. Fitzroy was born June 15th, 1519, acknowledged immediately, celebrated, made Duke of Richmond by age 6. But just months later, while Henry was still visiting Bessie's bed, she conceived again. This time, a daughter, and suddenly the celebration stopped. The visits ended. Bessie was married off to Gilbert Tailboys, a minor nobleman from Lincolnshire. The marriage happened quickly, quietly, before the pregnancy became too obvious. Elizabeth was born into Gilbert Tailboys' household and raised as his daughter. No royal acknowledgement, no titles, no land grants from the king, just silence, because daughters didn't prove anything. Fitzroy proved Henry could father sons. Elizabeth proved nothing except that women could get pregnant, and Henry already knew that. But historian Elizabeth Norton spent years researching the Tailboys family, digging through wills, court cases, property records, and she found something the king tried to bury. Henry never stopped watching over Elizabeth Tailboys, never stopped protecting her, in ways that made no sense for a former mistress's daughter. In 1541, during Henry's royal progress north with Catherine Howard, he stayed overnight at Elizabeth Tailboys' home. A king doesn't do that casually. Routes are planned months in advance, security vetted, every stop chosen for political or personal reasons. Henry chose to sleep under her roof, to sit at her table, to see her face. Why? Unless she was more than just the daughter of a woman he used to bed. Then there's her marriage. Henry arranged it personally, matched her with Thomas Wimbish, a wealthy royal ward who brought significant estates to the union. This wasn't a favour to Bessie Blount. Bessie had remarried, moved on, had other children. She didn't need Henry's help securing Elizabeth's future. But Henry did it anyway, chose the groom, approved the match, made sure Elizabeth was financially secure, and when Thomas Wimbish tried to call himself Lord Tailboys in right of his wife's inheritance, Henry denied the request, personally intervened to protect Elizabeth's title, her estates, her financial independence. Kings don't micromanage the marriages of their former mistresses' daughters, unless those daughters are theirs, unless the blood running through Elizabeth's veins matter to him in ways he could never publicly admit. The Tailboys family knew, or suspected. Elizabeth faced hostility from her paternal grandmother. Court cases erupted between her and Gilbert's relatives. They fought to limit her access to family estates, contested her inheritance, treated her like an outsider, as if she wasn't truly Gilbert's daughter, as if her real father was someone They couldn't challenge openly, but resented deeply. Elizabeth Tailboys lived and died without acknowledgement. She bore children, raised a family, managed estates, and carried the secret of her paternity to her grave, just like Ethelreda, just like Catherine Carey. Another daughter Henry used and discarded. Another woman wealthy enough to be comfortable, but not acknowledged enough to matter. Another ghost walking the halls of Tudor England, invisible to history, but present in the details historians finally started noticing centuries too late. Catherine Carey was born around 1524 into one of the most dangerous families in England. Her mother was Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister, the woman Henry bedded before he ever became obsessed with Anne. Before the annulment, before the break with Rome, before everything exploded into chaos and blood, Mary's affair with the king lasted years. Some historians say it ended by 1524. Others believe it continued longer. The records are deliberately vague, conveniently unclear, but Catherine was born right in the middle of that relationship. Born to a woman married to William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, a man connected to the court but not powerful, not wealthy, not someone who could protect his wife from a king who wanted her. The timing is damning. Catherine arrived while Henry was still visiting Mary's bed, while court gossip whispered about the king's mistress, while Mary's husband quietly accepted the arrangement because refusing a king's interest in your wife was a death sentence. And when Catherine was born, no one questioned Carey's paternity out loud. But behind closed doors, behind the tapestries and in the corridors where servants gossiped, everyone wondered. Henry never acknowledged her, never gave her estates, never arranged her marriage the way he did for Ethelreda. But that silence might have been more about politics than paternity, because acknowledging Catherine meant acknowledging Mary, and acknowledging Mary created a catastrophic problem years later when Henry wanted to marry Anne. In 1532, when Henry was trying to convince the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, one of the objections raised was that Henry had slept with Anne's sister. Canon law prohibited a man from marrying his former lover's sister. It was incest by affinity. The same argument Henry used against Catherine, claiming she was tainted by marrying his brother Arthur first. If Henry admitted he fathered children with Mary, he'd be confessing to a relationship that made his marriage to an invalid before it even began. So Catherine lived in a strange limbo, daughter of Mary Boleyn officially, possibly daughter of the king in reality. She married Francis Knollys in April 1540. A good match. Solid. Safe. She bore 16 children. An enormous family even by Tudor standards. And she served at court. Attended Elizabeth when she became queen. Stayed close to power her entire life without ever officially being part of the royal family. Her brother Henry Carey had a similar experience. Born around 1526, also during the king's affair with Mary. Also never acknowledged, but he rose high under Elizabeth's reign. Became Baron Hunsdon. Wealthy, trusted, powerful. Elizabeth treated him like family. Favoured him in ways that suggested she knew something others didn't. Or suspected. Or simply felt a connection she couldn't name. The scandal would have been immense. Double adultery. Both Henry and Mary were married to other people when Catherine was conceived. Church law condemned it. Society condemned it. Even in a court used to royal mistresses and bastard children, acknowledging Catherine would have been too much. Too messy. Too politically damaging. So Catherine Carey lived and died as William Carey's daughter. She raised her children, served her queen, and never spoke publicly about whose blood might truly run through her veins. Another secret. Another hidden daughter. Another woman erased by a king who valued sons and feared scandal more than he valued truth. Her descendants include some of England's most prominent families. Her bloodline spread through centuries. But her father's name, that died with her. In the world Henry ruled, daughters were bargaining chips. Legitimate daughters could be married off to foreign princes, used to secure alliances, traded like commodities to prevent wars or forge treaties. But they couldn't inherit unless every male option was exhausted. And illegitimate daughters, they had no value at all. They couldn't secure alliances, couldn't be married to royalty, couldn't inherit the throne no matter how many legitimate heirs died. They were just complications with no political upside. The law was clear. Primogeniture favoured males. Sons inherited before daughters. Legitimate children before bastards. Even if Henry had publicly acknowledged Ethelreda or Catherine or Elizabeth Tailboys, they would have stood behind Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth in the succession. Behind any legitimate children from his later marriages. Behind everyone who mattered. Their acknowledgement would give them status, but no power. Just visibility. And visibility was dangerous. marry them off to rival claimants, use them as figureheads for rebellions, claimed their children had stronger claims than whoever sat on the throne. The Wars of the Roses had only ended 34 years before Ethelreda was born. 60 years of civil war fought over competing royal bloodlines, over who had the better claim, over whether illegitimate branches of the royal family could challenge legitimate ones. Henry knew that history lived in its shadow. The last thing he needed was more claimants running around with royal blood and no loyalty. So daughters stayed hidden, given enough wealth to live comfortably, enough status to marry well, but never acknowledged, never given titles, never woven into the official narrative. They existed in the margins, present but not recorded, acknowledged privately but denied publicly. Ghosts who attended royal courts and left no footprints in official histories. Compare that to Fitzroy. Henry paraded him through court, gave him 2 dukedoms simultaneously, summoned him to Parliament, made him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, elected him to the Order of the Garter, all before he turned 10 years old, because sons could be legitimized if necessary. Parliament could pass an act declaring a bastard son legitimate. It had happened before in English history. It could happen again. Fitzroy was insurance, a backup plan if Henry's legitimate children died or proved unsuitable. But daughters? There was no scenario where acknowledging illegitimate daughters helped the king. If all his legitimate children died and he had no sons left, the crown would pass to his sister's descendants. To Margaret Tudor's line in Scotland, to Mary Tudor's granddaughter Lady Jane Grey, never to an illegitimate daughter. Canon law and parliamentary law agreed. Bastard daughters had no claim. Acknowledging them gave them nothing except dangerous visibility. So Henry made a cold calculation. Fitzroy got recognition because his gender made him valuable. The daughters got estates and arranged marriages because their gender made them worthless. Not as people, but as political assets. They couldn't carry on dynasties, couldn't secure successions, couldn't prevent civil wars. They were just women with inconvenient parentage. Better to keep them quiet, keep them comfortable, keep them out of the historical record. Let them live and die as footnotes, as rumors historians would argue about centuries later when it no longer mattered, when the throne they could never claim had passed through other hands, when their silence had already erased them from the official story of the Tudor dynasty. They lived their entire lives carrying a secret that could destroy them if spoken aloud. Audrey Malt, Catherine Carey, Elizabeth Tailboys, women who woke up every morning knowing they were daughters of a king but could never claim it. Women who attended court functions and watched their supposed half-siblings fight over a throne their blood might entitle them to, but their birth never would. Women who understood that silence was survival. Imagine the psychological weight. You were standing in Westminster Abbey watching Elizabeth's coronation in 1559. The crown is placed on her head. Thousands cheer. The kingdom celebrates its new queen. And you're there, close enough to see her face, close enough to see your father's eye staring back at you from her features. The same sharp Tudor nose, the same red hair, the same stubborn jaw that defined Henry's portraits. You share her blood, but you'll never share her power. You'll never stand where she stands, because you were born on the wrong side of marriage vows that didn't even involve your real parents. Ethelreda knew what it felt like to comfort Elizabeth in the Tower, to hold her while she wept, to fear for her life while Queen Mary decided whether her half-sister deserved execution or mercy. They shared something in those dark months, something deeper than mistress and lady-in-waiting. Perhaps Elizabeth knew. Perhaps someone had whispered the truth during one of those long nights when death felt inevitable. Or perhaps they both just recognized the weight each other carried. The burden of being Henry's daughter in a world that valued sons and destroyed women who threatened succession. Catherine Carey lived her whole life in Elizabeth's household, served her queen with devotion that went beyond duty, raised 16 children, built a family that would shape English nobility for generations. Never demanded acknowledgement, because demanding anything meant risking everything. Her children's futures, her husband's position, her own safety. Silence kept her comfortable. Speech would have destroyed her. Elizabeth Tailboys endured hostility from the family that should have been hers, fought court cases against relatives who treated her like an outsider, defended her inheritance against people who knew she wasn't truly Gilbert Tailboys as daughter, but couldn't prove it. She lived with that tension every day, being wealthy but questioned, being provided for but not accepted, being protected by a king who would never publicly claim her. The luxury they enjoyed came with invisible chains. Ethelred's estates, Catherine's court position, Elizabeth's royal protection. All of it bought their silence. All of it ensured they would never speak the truth that could destabilize the kingdom. They were living proof of Henry's appetites, his hypocrisy, his willingness to use women and discard the consequences. But they couldn't say that, couldn't write it, couldn't even whisper it too loudly. So they lived, attended court, raised children, managed estates, smiled at royal functions, and carried the secret to their graves. Ethelreda died in 1559, weeks after Elizabeth's coronation, as if seeing her half-sister crowned was the only ending her story needed. Catherine died in 1569, after decades of service to the Queen she might have called sister. Elizabeth Tailboys' death went largely unrecorded, like her life. Another woman erased by time and deliberate silence. They were comfortable cages, gilded prisons where wealth replaced acknowledgement and security demanded silence. And in the end, history nearly forgot them completely. Because that's what Henry wanted, what the crown required, what survival demanded. Daughters, especially illegitimate ones, were meant to be invisible. And these women understood that better than anyone. Picture an alternate history. One where Henry publicly acknowledged Audrey Malt as his daughter, where he granted her royal status, where her name appeared in official documents not as John Malt's bastard, but as the king's natural child. What would that world have looked like, and why did it terrify Henry enough to ensure it never happened? The succession was already a nightmare. By 1536, both Mary and Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate, stripped of their titles, removed from the line of succession. The Second Act of Succession stated the crown would pass to Henry's sons with Jane Seymour, then to sons or daughters from future marriages. Mary and Elizabeth written out completely, both bastards at the same time, despite being born to women Henry had legally married. Now add Ethelreda to that chaos, publicly acknowledged illegitimate daughter. She has no legal claim to the throne. Illegitimate and female means she's doubly disqualified. But laws can change, parliaments can be persuaded, and desperate people make dangerous alliances. Imagine Catholic rebels during Edward's Protestant reign. They opposed Lady Jane Grey's coup in 1553. They rallied around Mary because she represented the old faith. But what if they'd had another option, another Catholic daughter? One without Mary's reputation for severity, one younger, more malleable. Ethelreda could have become a figurehead, a compromise candidate, someone foreign powers could back without triggering the same resistance Mary faced. Or picture Protestant factions during Mary's reign. They plotted constantly to overthrow her, to put Elizabeth on the throne before Mary's time. Wyatt's rebellion in 1554 nearly succeeded. They imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower, suspecting her involvement. But what if there had been another Protestant daughter? Another option when Elizabeth seemed to risk it. Ethelreda, raised in the English Church, married to a loyal Protestant courtier. She could have become a rival claimant, a backup plan, a threat Mary would have had to eliminate. Henry understood this. He'd lived through the Wars of the Roses in living memory. 60 years of civil war fought over competing claims, over whether York or Lancaster had the better right to rule, over illegitimate branches challenging legitimate ones, over cousins murdering cousins for crowns soaked in blood. Henry's own father won the throne through conquest, not inheritance. His claim was weak, contested. The Tudors spent decades eliminating rival claimants, executing anyone with Plantagenet blood who might threaten their grip on power. Acknowledging illegitimate daughters meant creating more threats, more potential claimants, more people enemies could rally around. Even if Ethelreda herself had no ambitions, her children might. Her descendants could challenge future monarchs, could marry into foreign royal families and return with armies, could become the spark that ignited another civil war. Better to keep her hidden, give her estates quietly, marry her to someone loyal but not powerful. Let her live comfortably in the margins where she couldn't be used against the crown, where her existence remained plausible deniability, where historians could argue about her paternity for centuries while the throne passed safely through legitimate lines. Henry's silence wasn't cruelty, it was strategy, cold political calculation that valued stability over acknowledgement, that saw daughters as complications and illegitimate daughters as weapons his enemies could wield. Ethelred's comfortable obscurity wasn't neglect. It was the price of survival in a world where royal blood could be a death sentence if it fell into the wrong hands. And Henry made sure it never would. The evidence didn't disappear completely. Henry tried to bury it, tried to frame Ethelred's existence in ways that pointed away from him. But money talks, and the amounts involved scream. Start with the land grants. In May 1541, John Malt received lordships and manors in Berkshire, properties with vicarages and churches attached. Not small gifts, not token gestures, real wealth. Then in July 1544, Malt and Ethelreda together were granted over £1,800 for manors and lands in Somerset, properties that once belonged to Glastonbury Abbey, seized during the dissolution of the monasteries. By September 1546, another grant arrived. Over £1,300 for the lordship and manor of Kevelston. More Somerset properties, all for the benefit of John and Ethelreda. £1,700 in Tudor England wasn't pocket change. It was a fortune. The kind of money that bought estates, funded households, secured futures for entire families, and it all went to a tailor and his supposed bastard daughter. The official records list her as John Malt's illegitimate daughter by Joan Dingley alias Dobson. But John Malt didn't have that kind of money. He was a tailor, a skilled one certainly, the king's personal tailor with access to the wardrobe and royal chambers, but not wealthy enough to purchase manors worth thousands of pounds without help. The money came from Henry. The grants are documented, signed, official, but framed as transactions, as purchases, as if Malt was buying these properties through his own means when in reality the king was transferring wealth in ways that looked legitimate on paper, but served a deeper purpose, providing for a daughter he couldn't publicly claim. Then there's Sir John Harrington's account, the son of the man Ethelreda married. He wrote in his Nugi Antiqui that in the 38th year of Henry's reign, 1546, the king granted significant estates to John Malt and Ethelreda, who Harrington describes as the king's natural daughter. Natural daughter. That's not ambiguous language. That's direct. Clear. Harrington wrote that the king had special love and regard for her, that he granted these estates for her use and benefit, but she always passed for Malt's natural daughter. Passed for, not was. Passed for. As in pretended to be. As in the official story didn't match the private truth. Harrington also noted that shortly after receiving those estates, Ethelreda married his father, a confidential servant of the king. The marriage was arranged, approved by Henry personally. This wasn't a love match. It was placement. The king ensuring his daughter married someone loyal, someone trustworthy, someone who would protect her and never speak the truth publicly. Then there's the letter from Jonathan Leslie in 1656. Written nearly a century after Ethelreda's birth, he claimed the great King Henry VIII matched his darling daughter to John Harrington. Darling daughter. Again, not ward. Not the child of a servant he favoured. Daughter. Leslie sourced this information from Sir Andrew Markham, a descendant of John Harrington's second wife. Family law passed down. Whispers that became history. And finally, there's her relationship with Elizabeth. The emotional bond. The tears shed together in the Tower. The coronation attendance. The death just weeks after Elizabeth was crowned, as if seeing her half-sister safe on the throne was the closure Ethelreda needed, as if her purpose had been fulfilled. That's not how servants relate to queens. That's how sisters grieve and celebrate together. How family bonds endure even when acknowledgement is impossible. The evidence isn't conclusive. Henry made sure of that. But it's persistent, documented, woven through wills and land grants and family histories in ways that refuse to disappear completely. Ethelreda Malt was someone important, someone Henry protected and provided for, someone whose silence was bought with estates and whose existence was carefully hidden but never fully erased. Ethelreda Malt Harrington died in January 1559, the same month Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England, the same month the kingdom celebrated its new Protestant monarch, the same month that the Tower of London released its grip on the woman Ethelreda had comforted 5 years earlier when death seemed inevitable. She witnessed the coronation on January 15th, stood in Westminster Abbey and watched the crown placed on Elizabeth's head, and then she died. Weeks later, as if that moment was all she'd been waiting for. The timing feels intentional, poetic. Like her life had one final purpose and once fulfilled, there was nothing left. She'd lived 40 years in shadows, wealthy but unacknowledged, connected but never claimed. She attended Elizabeth through imprisonment, wept with her, shared her fear, formed bonds that went beyond servant and lady, beyond duty and obligation. Perhaps they were sisters. Perhaps they both knew it. Perhaps in those dark tower nights, truths were spoken that could never be repeated in daylight. When Elizabeth became queen, Ethelreda was there, not hidden, not erased, present, acknowledged in the only way that mattered, through attendance, through proximity, through the unspoken recognition that she belonged in that moment, that her presence meant something even if official records would never explain why. She left behind a daughter, Hester Harrington, born around 1550, a child who would carry forward whatever bloodline Ethelreda possessed, royal or not, acknowledged or not. Hester appears in records until 1568, and then nothing. She vanishes like her mother before her, like Catherine Carey's children who blended into nobility without carrying royal titles, like Elizabeth Tailboys' descendants who inherited estates but not acknowledgement. The silence that protected Ethelreda in life followed her into death. No grand funeral, no state mourning, no proclamation of loss. She was buried quietly. Her husband remarried within months. Isabella Markham became the second Lady Harrington, another woman connected to Elizabeth's household, another connection to the Queen that kept the family close to power even as Ethelreda disappeared from memory. John Harrington, her husband, wrote about her later. Not extensively, not in ways that reveal too much, but enough to suggest she mattered, that their bond was real, that the estates she brought to their marriage came with stories he couldn't fully tell. His son, also named John Harrington, became Elizabeth's godson, a poet, a writer, a man who recorded the family history in ways that hinted at royal connections without stating them outright. He's the one who called her the king's natural daughter in his writings, who documented the special love and regard Henry had for her, who preserved the story long enough for historians centuries later to piece together what the Tudors tried to bury. Ethelreda's estates passed to her daughter, then to the Harrington family line. Properties that once belonged to monasteries, lands seized during the dissolution, manors worth thousands of pounds, all granted to a tailor and his supposed bastard daughter by a king who officially never fathered her. The wealth remained, the acknowledgement didn't, and that disconnect is the evidence that won't disappear, the money that proved something mattered even when words couldn't say what, the estates that screamed truth louder than any proclamation Henry refused to sign. The legacy of a daughter who lived and died in shadows but left behind just enough light for history to eventually find her. History remembers Henry VIII for his 6 wives, for breaking with Rome, for dissolving the monasteries, for his 3 legitimate children who shaped England's future. Mary the Catholic, Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, Edward the boy king who died too young. These are the names in textbooks, the faces on coins, the stories told in documentaries and dramatized in film. But the daughters he buried tell a different story, one about power and control, about men who used women's bodies and then erased the consequences, about children born into luxury but denied acknowledgement, about silence purchased with estates and enforced with threats. Ethelreda Malt, Catherine Carey, Elizabeth Tailboys. These names appear in footnotes now, debated by historians, questioned by skeptics, argued over in academic papers that most people will never read. They lived, they breathed. They walked the same halls Mary and Elizabeth walked, attended the same courts, wore fine clothes, managed estates, raised children. They weren't myths or rumours. They were women with beating hearts and royal blood, who understood their existence threatened the very dynasty that created them. Their comfortable lives were cages. Golden ones, certainly. Ethelreda's St. Catherine's Court was a beautiful prison. Catherine's position in Elizabeth's household was prestigious servitude. Elizabeth Tailboys' royal protection came with invisible chains. They couldn't speak, couldn't claim their birthright, couldn't demand the acknowledgement their blood entitled them to, because demanding anything meant risking everything. Henry taught them that lesson through silence, through gifts that came with conditions, through arranged marriages that placed them with loyal men who understood discretion, through a lifetime of watching their acknowledged half-siblings fight for a throne they could never touch. The message was clear. Be grateful for what you receive. Never ask for more. Survival depends on invisibility. And they understood. They played their parts perfectly. Raised families, managed properties, attended coronations and funerals and royal functions. They smiled when required, curtsied when expected, and never once publicly claimed a truth that could have destroyed them. Because daughters, especially illegitimate ones, weren't worth dying for. Not in Henry's world. Not in any world that valued male heirs above everything else. Their erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, calculated to protect a dynasty built on shaky foundations. Henry's father won the throne through conquest, not clear succession. The Tudor claim was contested from the beginning. The last thing they needed was more complications, more claimants, more people with royal blood asking uncomfortable questions about legitimacy and inheritance. So the daughters disappeared, not physically. They lived long lives, but historically. Their names absent from official records, their faces never painted by court artists, their stories buried in wills and land grants that historians only started examining closely in recent decades. For 500 years, they were whispers, rumours, maybe daughters of the king or maybe just courtiers who got lucky with estate grants. But the evidence won't disappear. The money is documented. The marriages arranged by Henry himself are recorded. The emotional bonds with Elizabeth are noted by contemporaries. The timing of births and affairs and gifts all aligned perfectly to be coincidence. These women existed. They mattered, not because they threatened the throne, but because their silence protected it, because their erasure ensured stability, because their comfortable obscurity was the price Henry paid for keeping his dynasty intact. They deserved acknowledgement. They deserved to be claimed. They deserved their father's name spoken proudly over their births instead of whispered in corridors after their deaths. But Henry valued power over paternity, legacy over love, dynasty over daughters, and so they lived and died as footnotes, erased by the same man who gave them life, buried by history, forgotten by time, until historians started asking why a tailor received estates worth thousands, and the answers began to emerge from shadows 5 centuries deep.